You're listening to The Big Album Show with Paul Dillon and Dan O'Neill. Hello and welcome to The Big Album Show. This is the first episode, so we hope you enjoy it. Today we're going to be talking about Out of Time, which is the 7th studio album from the American band R.E.M. I'm Dan.
And I'm Paul. And together we are Dan and Paul doing the show, The Big Album Show. It's a two-person show. We hope to have a much bigger than a two-person audience, but you're very welcome to the show. We're talking about an album which is literally, Dan, out of time, almost 30 years old.
It's incredible how fast time flies by because, you know, although I was young at the time, I remember it coming out.
And did you love it?
Well, like, to be honest with you, I haven't been a massive R.E.M. fan, but it would have been kind of my first exposure to, I suppose, pop rock music. And I'll tell you where I remember it from. So here in Ireland, there was a massive kids TV show called The Den, hosted by a guy called Ray Darcy. So in 1991, when this album came out, shout out to Ray. It would have been his second year.
At Ray Darcy, we might give us a mention on the show.
You never know. You never know.
Paul, welcome onto the show. Sorry, go on. Well, yes, on the Den. Or Out of Time on the Den, yes.
Out of Time on the Den. But remember at the end of the Den, they used to show a music video.
Yeah.
And
yes, they did. I used to love that part. That's a great memory. Love it.
They used to always play one. And because Shiny Happy People was such a kind of a happy-go-lucky song, the video was quite colourful. They kind of played it because they knew kids would like it.
They always play this, and you're absolutely right. That brings me right back.
Yeah, it was quality. And, you know, I love that song. I know a lot of people hate that song. But recently I was listening to it. It is a classic. And you know what I love as well? The version of the song they did with the Muppets, Furry Happy Monsters. It's quality.
You're listening to The Big Album Show with Paul and Dan. Please remember to subscribe, hit like, and remember to follow us on our social media platforms at The Big Album Show. For me, I mean, when you step back in time, no pun intended, out of time, right? You go back almost 30 years ago, March 12th, 1991. You look at the time and you look at the context. Out of Time was the first, Dan, if you remember, the first of the four big 90s R.E.M. albums. R.E.M. were huge throughout the 90s, but Out of Time was the one that really took them up, wasn't it? Because it was the one that got them massively mainstream, the Grammy Award, the big hit single. That was, of course, Losing My Religion. Not my favorite song on the album, I have to say, but it was their big breakthrough. They had already broken through that famous college American rock scene coming out of Seattle. You had, of course, the emergence. That year, of course, was the year of Nevermind, which I think Nevermind came out 6 months after Out of Time, if I remember correctly, Dan. Am I right in that?
Yeah, around that. And you had albums like 10 by Pearl Jam, Screamadelica by Primal Scream, the Black Album by Metallica, and Octung Baby. It was a great year for music in many ways.
Absolutely brilliant year. And of course, this was the time when, you know, an album launch was massive. I remember Out of Time coming out. My brother was a massive R.E.M. fan. I remember the album coming out. We had it on tape, of course, which is how things were done back then. But this was the era of the album. The albums were still huge. And you mentioned some classics there, Octung Baby, Screamadelica. But albums were huge back in the 90s.
And you know what was really weird, Paul? I had a look at the Irish singles charts around the same time, right?
Yeah.
And although the album charts were incredible and you had all these amazing albums, in the single charts at the time when the album came out, you had classics such as Do the Bartman by the cast of The Simpsons. You had 2 singles released by Zig and Zag.
Fantastic.
You had Always Look on the Bright Side of Life by Monty Python.
Love it.
Literally, the singles charts were a joke. But some of the greatest albums were a joke.
That's all good stuff there, man. What are you saying?
Well, I suppose it is good stuff in some ways, but the only kind of real song on the actually the Doors and Queen were.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there. Go for ahead. What did you say?
Man. No, I was just saying the Doors and Queen were on the were in the charts as well. Weirdly, there was this kind of phase of kind of old songs entering the charts again.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny when you cast your mind back. I mean, everything has changed, and not everything for the better.
Loads of
But
things have changed, man. Think
sorry.
about it. Who was when you think about what 1991 was like for people? You had Charles Haughey here in Ireland, who was the Taoiseach. You had the IRA firing mortar bombs at Downing Street. You had Blackboard Jungle beginning on Network 2, the Cold War ending, the Gulf War, and Everything I Do by Bryan Adams all over the airways.
The most
Those were the good
significant
old
thing
days.
there is, of course, the Bryan Adams part of it.
Yeah, yeah.
I
And
mean,
Roy Keane debuting for Ireland as well.
when you look back at it, though, let's get serious now for a moment, right? I mean, Out of Time by R.E.M. is a classic album, right? It was the first of the four big 90s classic R.E.M. albums. Out of Time first for 91, followed by Automatic for the People, followed by Monster, which is absolutely brilliant. Followed then by the one with Ebo the letter on it, So Fast So Numb, New Adventures in Hi-Fi. I mean, four classic brilliant albums. New Adventures in Hi-Fi wouldn't have sold nearly as much as the others, but all amazing albums. And I mean, of course, we'll talk maybe about track by track in a moment about the album, but of course, R.E.M. were massive in Ireland in the 90s, right? So of course, we're coming at this from the Irish perspective. You're down in Limerick, I'm in Dublin. You remember, Dan, they did the Monster tour. They didn't tour the Out of Time album. They had done some pretty big tours previously, but in the States, they did a few arena shows sort of around the Out of Time period. But they did a massive tour. They did some huge tours in the 90s, and the Monster tour was absolutely massive. Of course, it nearly broke the band, led to the departure of the drummer Bill Berry. But they played a huge Slane gig. Do you remember that one, Dan? That cast your mind back to that Slane gig that they did?
I have some recollection of it being in the media for. Was there some kind of negativity surrounding that particular gig?
There was, I mean, and there was some pretty tragic events around that gig. We might come back to that actually just in a little bit, because it was really, really sad and very tragic. But of course, then later they played a big show in Lansdowne Road, which I was at.
Were you at any of them? You
Yes,
were
I
at it.
was. That was
What was it
following
like,
the
man?
Up album. Not the greatest R.E.M. album. There's a few beautiful tracks on it, but what was it like? It was great. It was back then. Gigs were different. They were a lot rougher. There used to be kind of fights at gigs, and
Yeah.
there used to be a lot more kind of jumping and pushing and shoving and all of that kind of thing. And I remember at one stage,
at R.E.M.
yeah, at R.E.M. I mean, Michael Stipe said
Wow.
had to appeal to people, not to be jumping on each other, and he'd been at the Pop Mart tour in Dublin not that long before, and he was referencing that, and he was saying, "Hey guys, be careful out there." A brilliant, brilliant frontman, Michael Stipe, and we'll touch on him again, just his absolute brilliance. Let's look at the album for a minute, Dan, because it's all about the music. Give us your top 3 tracks at a time.
My top 3 tracks. Well, I have to say, I really enjoy Near Wild Heaven. It's an incredible song. Of course, Michael Stipes doesn't sing lead vocals on it. It's Mike Mills. But one of the refreshing things about going back and listening to albums like Out of Time is the fact that they don't feel overproduced, and particularly this album, because you mentioned the fact that R.E.M. had been touring an awful lot, and they wanted to kind of get away from the kind of traditional electric sound they had, and they started playing things like mandolins, famously on the album. So there's this kind of not underproduced, but correctly produced album, which includes acoustic ornamentation. It includes strings and so on. And I think you hear that beautifully on Near Wild Heaven. You have the jangly guitar that almost is reminiscent of the Byrds, and Mike Mills lead vocals, and then Michael Stipe coming in on the chorus. So I enjoyed that one.
I love Near Wild Heaven. I mean, when I went back to listen to the
Yeah.
album again, I was just reminded of just what a great song it is. It is not, I mean, of course, everybody goes Losing My Religion. It is the first song that everyone remembers off the album. Big number one hit for them. But for me, the top track is Near Wild Heaven. And of course, it's not, one of the things about it that people forget is that Michael Stipe doesn't do the lead vocal on it.
Yeah, and it doesn't suffer as a result. It's different, but it's still as powerful as any of the other songs.
It is. It's powerful. What next, Dan, for you? So that's your number one. What's next for you?
Okay, another one, and you know what? I'm staying away from things like Losing My Religion, not because I don't like them, but anyone who kind of remembers the time and lived through the period remembers that songs like "Losing My Religion" were everywhere,
Yeah,
and I won't
massive
say
tune.
overplayed, but it's hard for me to kind of listen to it now. To be honest, even though it's a fantastic song, which I truly love
Yeah,
it, when it comes on the radio, I kind of shy away from it a little bit just because I've heard it so much.
yeah.
But
I hear
when I
you,
turn
man.
on a song on the album like "Half a World Away,"
Love it.
and I hear the kind of for me it kind of represents hope and resilience amongst sadness, which is it's classic
I
kind of
love it,
Michael
Dan.
Stipe,
I love it.
you
It's
know, and
actually, it's also, and we did not script this beforehand. It's also my
mm,
second favorite track on the
wow.
album. Absolutely love it. Love how kind of profound and serious it is, but there's a little brightness in it. But one of the things about that song as well, of course, is years later, who would have a song called "Half the World Away"? Oasis. They just changed the A to the
Oasis, yeah.
D.
Well, that's not like Oasis to kind of borrow from other people, is it?
Dan, give us your. Sorry, you were saying. What else have you got to say about "Half a World Away"? Before I cut in there.
I just love it, and I remember. I'll tell you when I bought the album. I bought the album in around 2001, right?
Mm,
Because I went into, I still remember it, man, because this is what happens when you buy these albums when you're younger, and they're kind of formative in terms of your musical development, I suppose. They stick out in your head. And I remember going into Golden Discs in Stillorgan in Dublin, and I actually went in and I was planning on buying the album Reveal. It was 2001, but Out of Time was on sale and I had limited pocket money. So I bought Out of Time. But Half a World Away, for some reason, it was one of those beautiful songs that just stood out to me. There's something so fragile about the lead vocals in it, um, and as I say, for me, it just resonates this whole hope amongst kind of a sadness, and I think that's where Michael Stipe's lyrics are most powerful when he kind of juxtaposes a kind of a sad fragility
yeah.
with a sense of happiness and hope. It's a
You know,
strange kind of thing.
it's kind of like find yourself a front man who can do both, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah,
he
it's bizarre.
I mean,
And it
he's really just one of the iconic music figures, and I don't think he'd reached his peak at that time. I think that came later, right? But I think you're right.
mm,
There was often a subtlety to what he was doing at a time that wasn't there. Maybe some of the later records, and it certainly wasn't
mm,
there in some of the records that came towards the end period. And we kind of can speak of an end period with R.E.M. because, of course, that they are no longer with us in the active sense, very much with us in the physical sense, but no longer recording. Dan, your third track, please.
now this is a difficult one. This is a very difficult one because I'm looking at the list, and there's there's so many decent tracks. Now there's a few on it on the album that I'm not so sure about, but we'll get to that. But it's kind of I'm just going to be controversial, just to annoy people listening. I'm gonna say "Shiny Happy People." I love it. I could listen to it all day. I love Kate Pearson's vocals on it. I
Yeah.
love the jangly guitars. I know it's not a kind of a traditional REM style song. And I know even, some of the band dislike it themselves, and a lot of REM fans dislike it. But for me, I think it's close to a perfect pop song.
Dan, it's funny, and I have the evidence to prove it because I have my list. My top three songs were "Near Wild Heaven," "Half a World Away," and "Shiny Happy People." It is lovely. It's beautiful. It's fantastic. It's pretty timeless. Still sounds absolutely fresh. Still sounds really good. I'm not quite sure why so many REM fans are not the biggest actual fans of "Shiny Happy People." I suspect, Dan, it may have something to do with its kind of quote unquote pure pop basis. I mean, it is an
Mm,
absolute mainstream pop song. And I mean, obviously REM were a pretty serious, pretty profound band. They picked up a lot of political causes, a lot of environmental causes. They're a band that meant a lot to people. Very, very serious in terms of albums. Their albums often touched on that kind of, as you were saying there earlier, very, they dealt with a lot of very deep themes and sad themes and so on. But I mean, "Shiny Happy People" for me, absolutely love it. I think it's great fun.
mm.
It's a
No,
great lockdown song.
It's a great lockdown song. Yeah, well, there's
And
certainly an
everybody can
element of
hum it. Everybody
escapism in
can
it.
hum it. Sorry,
Yeah, yeah. There's certainly an element of like of escapism in it. But
definitely.
again, if you listen to the kind of the instrumentation and the kind of slow orchestral kind of bit at the beginning, which kind of leads into this jangly again,
Yeah.
happy guitar piece, and then you have Kate Pearson's vocals. It just
Yeah.
it's close to the perfect pop song for me. It really is.
Do you want to hum? Do you
Um,
want to hum a bit of it there?
no, I
Go
don't
on, just
know.
do it. Do it. You got it. You got it. Because we can't play music on this. It's the next best thing. Yeah, everybody knows it. I mean, just let's move off the tunes for 2 seconds because R.E.M.
Yeah.
albums were always about more than the music, right? One of the things
Mm,
about the R.E.M. Period, not the R.E.M. period, but one of the things about all these R.E.M. albums is that they all carried really serious themes, and this album, Out of Time, has been described as the most political album of all time. Dan, do you remember how political R.E.M. were and political Michael Stipe was in particular? But one of the things about Out of Time, as people forget, is that there was a huge petition that accompanied the album. Thousands of people signed the petition. It was part of the Rock the Vote campaign, and the petition was to support allowing people under the age of 21 to register with their driving license. And it led to a huge increase in the numbers of people voting. That campaign was the brainchild of a guy called Jeff Gold, who was an executive at Warner. And the reason why Gold wanted to do this big campaign was twofold. And this is fascinating. And it's like, this is different era stuff, right? This is history stuff here. Do you remember,
mm.
Dan, back in the 90s when you used to buy a CD, there used to be a little sticker on loads of the records? Do you remember the little sticker?
Yeah,
The little parent advisory. Do you remember
yeah,
that?
yeah, I do. Yeah, yeah.
This is other era stuff. I mean, that was the brainchild of a group called the Parents Music Resource Centre, which folded in the late 90s, but had been on the go for maybe 15 years up until that point. And they had waged these big campaigns about the influence of lyrics and warning buyers about the supposedly risque lyrics that were in songs. And you get those little black and white stickers. But one of the reasons Gold wanted to do that big campaign with Rock the Vote was so that they could roll back on that. Eventually, it would go down in history as a really very political album. And of course, that whole period now of parental advisory and little stickers and albums is long gone. So it was a very political album. And of course, back in those days, the CDs, again, this is like, it's other era stuff, but they used to kind of come in this big long box, a big wooden,
Mm,
not a box, sorry, a kind of a wooden package. And R.E.M.,
mm.
of course, is famous environmentalists. Remember, they had the album Green. They were committed to those
Mm.
environmental causes very early on, before they were cool. um, they didn't like that big package, and Gold convinced them, let's do something meaningful with them, and let's get involved in this campaign to support people getting to under the age of 21 registering to vote. And many people did, and that is something that is, again, out of time, because it looks
It
nowadays to the sort of, in the year 2021 with everything that's going on, petitions, wooden packages, sorry, not wooden packages, paper packages on albums, sorry, not wooden, paper, kind of a big paper package on your CD. I wonder if maybe some of the listeners might remember that, but there used to be this big package. And the Parents Music Resource Centre and Parental Advisory, it's from a different age, right?
yeah, it just seems like a completely different world. Like now, the idea of like I don't know. Now people just do petitions online or have a Twitter hashtag, But
Hashtag the
what
big
what
album show being the best of the hashtags.
yeah, yeah, that's it. But the thing that strikes me, although I think it's maybe a bit over the top to call it the most politically significant album in the history of the United
Sorry,
States
sorry, Dan.
because
I said it. Therefore, it is right. No, just kidding. Sorry. Go on.
no, but because what's funny about it to me is that although there was a petition on the back of it, right? The
Hmm.
actual album itself isn't political at all. I'm sure you can find hints at some political topics. Maybe KRS One's little rap at the end of Radio Song, for instance,
Hmm.
might be classed as political.
He
But
was huge, of course, at
there's
that
very
time.
little.
He was absolutely massive at that time. In anyway, sorry,
Yeah,
go on.
was he?
Yes,
Was he?
yeah, he was huge then, massive, massive. But sorry, I didn't
I
interrupt
have
your
to say,
flow.
no, 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 don't worry. I have to say, I don't, radio song for me, it kind of just, it grates on me a little bit. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah. I like it. I mean, I'm there for it, to be honest. I think it's good. Like the introduction, like the start. I like the little rap in it. I think it's catchy, and it's kind of a nice, slow kind of way to start an album.
no,
And for me, it works really, really well.
no. For me, right, I look at the lyrics of it, right? And one of the lyrics in it is, when I got to the show, yo ho ho.
Mm,
Not particularly the strongest lyrics, and I'm not saying it to rubbish the album, but I'll tell you one of my takes on the album. My hot takes is that the album is fantastic, apart from the first song on the album and the last song on the album, Wild Honey. Both of those tunes to me let the rest of the album down. For me, like I like hip hop music, I like rap music. KRS-One's style of rap music for me doesn't fit with the song. The song, the kind of introduction to the song sounds like classic R.E.M, but when you
mm,
get into that kind of the kind of bouncy organ, and then KRS-One's kind of old school rap, it doesn't kind of fit together. It feels to me as if, rap was very popular at the time, and the band said, let's throw a bit in
oh,
on the album just to kind of.
controversial take.
I
It
know,
could
I
be
know,
cancelled
I
before
know.
we even begin.
I know,
I
yeah.
don't. I
No,
don't
but
agree at all. I mean, I think it's great, and I think. I think I mean, the rap is short, right? But it's. I think it fits
mm,
really, really well, and I think it's a really good opener. And then it feeds right in then to Losing My Religion, which of course was the massive global hit, which everybody knows. And to be honest with you, which I don't like. And if there's anybody who attended St. Mary's Diocesan School, well, no one will remember this, but for some bizarre reason, I ended up playing that in a band in the school assembly in the late 90s in the school in Drogheda, and you don't want to do that. And after you've played Losing My Religion in a band to a school assembly in Drogheda in the late 90s, you ain't never gonna listen to Lose My Religion ever again.
what
Dan, one
instrument
thing
did
that
you play, Paul?
drums, one
Drum.
thing that we might just return to, because we touched on it, and we'll come back to the album at the end and maybe give it a little rating, right?
Yeah.
But we mentioned the Slane gig, right?
Mm,
There's something very, very tragic that happened there. Two people lost their lives crossing in the river that day, the River Boyne, and it's something that I never forgot. Grew up not too far away from Slane, and it really marked. It was just a terrible, terrible, tragic event. The gig, of course, is well remembered. It was part of the Monster Tour, massive tour, huge success as a gig. Oasis played in support, but for me, it'll always be marked by that terrible tragedy in the River Boyne. That was 1995, I think, if I remember correctly.
mm.
And yeah, looking back at it, it just. Do you remember that gig, Dan? You don't remember the gig? It was a huge show at the time.
No, no, I don't remember it in great detail. I remember kind of, hearing of it, but that's
Yeah,
about it. But it's so
Dan.
sad.
So absolutely, it's so
Mm,
sad.
mm.
Dan, let's rate R.E.M out of time, out of 10. Firstly, where would you rate it in your list of R.E.M albums? Go for it.
Well, I think in fairness, it has some of REM's best work. When you
Mm,
think of REM, I think if you ask people who don't know an awful lot about REM to name, 5 REM songs, they're
mm.
gonna mention "Losing My
And
Religion."
Shiny Happy
They're
People,
gonna
yeah,
mention "Shiny Happy People."
definitely.
So, I mean, you have to say it's up there, in the top one probably.
Yeah, I mean, for me, right, it's not my favorite. It would be my fourth favorite R.E.M album. I love those four albums in a row that R.E.M did in the 90s. But actually, the what my favorite of them would be New Adventures in Hi-Fi as number one,
Mm,
Monster number two, which is a great album. Hope we come back to it on the big album show. New Adventures in Hi-Fi is just is fantastic. It's just really, really good. Every track is good. I would my third my third would be Automatic for the People.
Mm.
which is fantastic. And
Yeah.
then At a Time for me would be fourth, but for me, At a Time is a really really good album. Really like it. I mean, for me, it stands a test of time. I couldn't believe when I went back to listen to it again how kind of moved I
Mm.
was by it. I find it's quite profound at times, but then it's
It
also
is.
quite funny and silly and frivolous. For me, it gets a very solid 8 out of 10 as we approach its 30th anniversary. Where does it get? What does it get for you out of 10, Dan?
Well, I think that we've agreed a lot on this podcast. We picked the same favorite songs on the album, and you know what? I'm going to agree with you. 8 out of 10 is a very very fair score for At a Time, and it certainly stands the test of time. It sounds fresh while not sounding as overproduced as some albums currently on the scene. And I think even the album art hasn't aged at all because it's just clear, clear font with a nice background, looks great, and that the whole package is a solid 8.
Yeah, and of course you have to remember when we're talking about these big classic albums, these big albums, that you're not just talking about the tracks, you're talking about the package, you're talking about everything. So yeah, listen, great album At a Time, brilliant title for an album as well. So just to say before we finish up today, please make sure, now this is the serious part, make sure to follow us Twitter, The Big Album Show, Facebook, Instagram. You got to follow us, Big Album Show. We are coming at you with the biggest and the best albums and celebrating and marking their anniversaries. This is the first of many. Thank you very much for listening. Please share, bring along another listener if you like the show, and make sure to follow us wherever you get our podcast. And if you really like us, please give us a rating.
You're listening to The Big Album Show with Paul Dillon and Dan O'Neill.